You probably picture the American Revolution the exact same way I always did.
Yeah.
You imagine this group of incredibly noble gentlemen in powdered wigs.
Right, standing around quietly signing parchment.
Exactly. While outside, these stoic soldiers march in perfect straight lines to fife and drum. It's neat, it's orderly, and it feels completely inevitable.
Like it was just destiny.
Yeah. But we are stripping all of that away today because behind the marble statues and the sanitized textbook summaries we all got, the actual birth of this nation was fueled by, well, street gang intimidation.
Highly calculated political spin machines, too.
Oh, absolutely. Deeply mutinous generals, and a totally desperate midnight gamble on Christmas Day.
It is a vastly more dangerous and honestly gritty story than most people realize. When you actually read the primary sources, the letters, the military logs, the personal diaries, you don't see a predetermined victory.
You really don't.
No, you see a chaotic, fragile insurgency that was constantly on the verge of total collapse.
Exactly. And that precarious reality all starts with a monumental misunderstanding over an invoice. Because before there was a revolution, there was just an incredibly broke British Empire trying to settle its bills.
Very true.
So to set the stage for you, the listener, it is 1765. King George III and the British Parliament have just finished fighting the 7 Years' War.
Which they essentially fought to defend the American colonies from the French.
Right, but wars are astronomically expensive. They're in the hole for roughly 60 million pounds. So to recoup the costs, Parliament passes the Stamp Act.
Which, when you look at it from Parliament's shoes, it felt entirely justified.
How so?
Well, the British public was already buckling under immense taxation at home. The government's logic was simple. We just deployed our military to protect your borders in North America. We spent a fortune doing it.
So North America needs to help foot the bill.
Precisely.
Right, and I should clarify, it wasn't a tax on postage stamps like we think of today.
Not at all. It was a tax on virtually every single piece of printed paper used in the colonies.
Like legal documents, right?
Legal documents, ships' papers, land grants, newspapers, almanacs, even playing cards and dice.
Wow, playing cards.
Yeah. You had to purchase a specific stamp from a British-appointed distributor to prove you had paid the tax on that paper.
Now, I have to be honest here. I'm a parent of two, and this dynamic feels incredibly familiar to me. Wasn't the king kind of justified?
That's a fair question.
It's like a parent suddenly demanding retroactive rent from a teenager who's been managing their own backyard treehouse for years.
That is a great analogy.
Sure, the teenager is furious, but hey, the parent paid for the lumber. Wasn't asking the colonists to buy a few stamps, an incredibly small price for the absolute security provided by the British military.
That is precisely how King George viewed it. He thought of the colonists as his subjects. Englishmen who just happened to be born in America.
But who were acting like petulant, ungrateful children.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the colonists didn't see themselves as teenagers in a treehouse. Over the previous 150 years, they had essentially built a nation within an empire.
Because of the vast distance, right?
Right, a 3,000-mile ocean voyage that took weeks or sometimes months. So they had grown used to managing their own affairs.
They were totally self-sufficient.
They had their own democratically elected assemblies, their own independent newspapers, their own complex local tax systems.
So when a parliament 3,000 miles away suddenly says, we are directly taxing you, it isn't just about the money. It's about autonomy.
Precisely. It was an existential threat. For the colonists, it wasn't about the pennies it cost for a stamp on a deck of playing cards.
It was the principle of the thing.
It was about the emotional and political core of the conflict who was in control. They deeply resented having a tax imposed by a faraway parliament where they had absolutely zero representation.
Because the fear was, if Parliament can tax our paper today without our consent, what stops them from taxing our land tomorrow?
Or our homes, yeah.
And their reaction to this threat was definitely not a polite letter-writing campaign. Enter the Sons of Liberty. Now, the name sounds like a distinguished debate club, but they were essentially an underground insurgency.
Very much so.
They formed this incredibly strategic alliance between street gangs, local artisans, and wealthy merchants. And they didn't just write op-eds. They used brutal physical intimidation to control the narrative.
Their tactics were far from civilized debate. The Sons of Liberty recognized early on that they needed to silence opposition quickly.
By any means necessary.
They targeted royal officials and loyalists, people who remain loyal to the king with psychological and physical terror. The most infamous method, which we've all heard of but rarely understand the reality of, was tarring and feathering.
Put yourself in the shoes of a loyalist in Boston at this time.
Yeah.
Explain the actual mechanics of what tarring and feathering meant, because it wasn't a cartoon prank.
No, it was a horrific form of torture. A mob would drag a person out of their home, often in the middle of the night.
Terrifying.
They would strip the victim naked. Then they would heat pine tar until it was boiling, literally bubbling, and pour or paint it all over the person's bare skin. Oh my God.
The heat of the tar would cause immediate, agonizing third-degree burns. While the tar was still hot and sticky, the mob would cover the victim in goose feathers.
That is just barbaric.
And it didn't end there. Finally, they would often parade the person through the town on a cart, forcing them to publicly renounce their loyalty to the king.
It's pure visceral terror. You survive that, but you are physically scarred for life. And the message to the rest of the town is crystal clear. If you support the British, this is what happens to you.
It was highly effective intimidation.
They literally went after Thomas Hutchinson, who was the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. And the tragic irony of Hutchinson is that he personally opposed the Stamp Act.
He did. He actually wrote letters to London arguing against it, believing it would ruin the colonial economy.
But because he was a fifth-generation Bostonian who was legally duty-bound to enforce the king's law, a mob surged through Boston, broke down his doors, and absolutely dismantled his house.
They destroyed everything. They chopped down his trees, they drank his wine cellar, they destroyed his irreplaceable historical manuscripts. They also smashed the printing presses of loyalist newspapers in New York.
All while ironically proclaiming that liberty was the principle they were fighting for.
Right. It really shatters the illusion of a purely noble intellectual revolution.
It does. While men of property and education, like a 29-year-old John Adams up in Massachusetts or Patrick Henry down in Virginia, were using logic to draft anti-tax resolutions, the street-level mob was using violence.
And the intellectual arguments and the physical intimidation were working in tandem.
Exactly. The mobs made it literally impossible for the British to collect the tax because every single stamp distributor in the colonies resigned out of fear for their lives.
Meanwhile, across the ocean, you have Benjamin Franklin trying to put out this massive fire. And Franklin's position here completely blew my mind.
He's an interesting figure at this point.
At 59, he is the most famous American in the world. He's a self-made celebrity, incredibly wealthy, a brilliant scientist who invented the lightning rod, and he is living his absolute best life in London.
He was completely enamored with English society. He loved the coffee houses, the intellectual debates, the scientific societies. He saw himself as a proud, loyal Briton.
So he's trying desperately to broker a compromise. Because he loves the mother country, he's serving as the unofficial ambassador, trying to explain the American perspective to Parliament.
But ultimately, it wasn't Franklin's diplomacy that solved the Stamp Act crisis. It was brute force economics.
Because the colonists realized that violence could stop the local tax collectors, but it couldn't change the law in London.
Exactly. To do that, they had to hit Britain where it hurt their wallets.
They organized a massive merchant boycott. They just stopped buying anything from England.
And you have to imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of coordinating a boycott across 13 entirely different colonies.
Right, using only hand-delivered letters and newspapers.
But it worked. The English merchants, the bankers, the manufacturers, they all started bleeding money. Warehouses in London were overflowing with goods they couldn't sell.
So those British merchants turned around and put immense pressure on their own parliament.
And Parliament caved. They repealed the Stamp Act in 1766.
The colonists celebrated it as a massive victory. They had forced the world's greatest power to back down.
But that celebration was completely hollow, wasn't it?
Yeah, because Parliament immediately passed the Declaratory Act, basically saying, we are repealing this specific tax, but we declare we have the absolute right to tax you in all cases whatsoever.
They retreated on the money, but they doubled down on the power.
Exactly. The fundamental question of who had the right to rule was not resolved. It was merely paused.
And this leads directly to a far more dangerous phase. Because Parliament keeps trying to devise new ways to prove they are the boss, passing taxes on glass, lead, paint, and tea.
And the colonists respond with more boycotts and more street violence.
Until finally, Britain decides they have had enough of the lawlessness in Boston.
So they dispatch thousands of heavily armed British troops to occupy the city.
A huge escalation.
Imagine your hometown suddenly turning into a volatile police state. Boston was a small peninsula back then, with a population of maybe 15,000 people.
Right.
Suddenly, you have 1,000 heavily armed soldiers patrolling your streets, sleeping in your public buildings, and standing guard on your corners.
It was a disastrous recipe. The soldiers were sent there to impose order, but their very presence became a lightning rod for discontent.
They were just universally hated.
Well, the soldiers were poorly paid, they were far from home, and yeah, they were universally despised by the locals. They were constantly verbally abused, spat upon, and harassed.
And this tension inevitably boils over on the freezing night of March 5th, 1770, in what we now call the Boston Massacre.
A highly misunderstood event.
Totally. The version of the Boston Massacre most of us learned in grade school is an unprovoked execution of innocent people. But the primary sources show something entirely different.
The reality was far closer to a panicked reaction to a highly dangerous, chaotic mob riot.
Break down exactly what happened that night. It starts with a single British sentry.
Yes. A lone British sentry, Private Hugh White, was standing guard outside the custom house. A group of local patriots started heckling him.
Just giving him a hard time.
Right, but the verbal abuse escalated, and soon the church bells began to ring. Now, in 18th century Boston, ringing the church bells at night meant there was a fire.
It was an alarm.
It was a call for every able-bodied man to grab a bucket and run into the street.
So suddenly you have hundreds of angry, cold, frustrated colonists pouring into the streets, and they realize there is no fire. But there is a British soldier standing there.
And the crowd surrounds him. The British commander, Captain Thomas Preston, sees the danger and marches a small squad of 7 soldiers out to rescue the sentry.
But the crowd doesn't back down.
No, they surround the squad, and they aren't just shouting. They are hurling chunks of ice, packed snowballs, rocks, and jagged oyster shells at the soldiers' heads.
Oyster shells. That could seriously cut you.
Exactly. They are actively daring the soldiers to fire, screaming, "Fire, damn you, fire!"
In that chaos, a soldier gets hit with a club, he slips on the ice, his musket discharges, and all hell breaks loose.
The guards panic, their guns go off, and 5 civilians are killed.
Including Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent who is widely viewed as the first martyr of the Revolution.
It was a tragedy, without question. But it was not a coordinated, murderous execution ordered by a tyrannical captain.
But that is exactly how it was sold to the public. As a journalist, I know a little bit about how to package a narrative to get a reaction.
Oh, absolutely.
Within hours of the shooting, a local silversmith named Paul Revere created an engraving of the event. And this engraving is a masterpiece of 18th century clickbait.
Graver completely recast the chaotic reality into a calculated crime.
He sure did. In Revere's engraving, you don't see an angry mob throwing ice and rocks. You see a group of well-dressed, peaceful gentlemen standing there innocently.
It's pure fiction.
You don't see a panicked squad of soldiers slipping on ice. You see a neat, orderly row of British redcoats with their commander standing safely behind them with his sword raised, actively giving the order to execute civilians.
He even changed the name of the custom house to Butcher's Hall in the picture.
It was incredibly effective propaganda. He printed thousands of copies and spread them throughout the colonies. It ignited absolute fury.
It was the birth of American political spin.
It was the exact equivalent of a heavily edited, completely decontextualized viral video designed to manipulate public emotion. Revere shifted the narrative so successfully that the truth didn't even matter to the public anymore.
But the truth absolutely mattered to one man, and this brings us to John Adams.
Right. In the aftermath, the British soldiers were arrested and put on trial for murder.
The public was screaming for them to be hanged. No lawyer in Boston wanted to touch the case.
Too toxic.
Way too toxic. But John Adams, who was a vocal patriot and a rising star in the anti-tax movement, stepped forward to be their defense attorney.
Why? He was risking his life, his family's safety, and his entire political reputation to defend the enemy.
Because Adams rigidly adhered to the law. He recognized a profound danger in the patriot movement. If the Patriots allowed mob rule to dictate justice, they were no better than the tyrants they claimed to be fighting.
That's a very principled stance.
He believed that the right to a fair trial and the presumption of innocence were the very foundations of a free society. During the trial, Adams meticulously dismantled the propaganda.
He brought in witnesses to describe the ice, the clubs, the sheer terror the soldiers faced.
He famously said, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence."
Wow. And he actually won an acquittal for Captain Preston and 6 of the soldiers, with 2 others receiving only minor punishments for manslaughter.
It's an incredible moment that highlights the deeply divided nature of the patriot movement itself.
You had the street-level rebel-rousers, like the Sons of Liberty, who relied on violent intimidation.
And you had principled legal minds, like Adams, who believed a revolution wasn't worth having if it didn't respect human rights.
But the tension in Boston was far from resolved. Over the next 3 years, Parliament kept pushing. They repealed most of the taxes, but they deliberately left a small tax on tea.
Just to prove they still had the right to do it, it was a flex.
Precisely. And they also gave a monopoly to the East India Company, effectively undercutting local American smugglers.
Which leads us to December 1773 and the Boston Tea Party.
Again, we picture a fun, rebellious party. In reality, it was a massive act of corporate sabotage.
Oh, massive.
50 men disguised themselves in a terrible impersonation of Mohawk Indians, which was basically a way to hide their identities while making a symbolic statement about being native to America. They board 3 ships, and they spend hours methodically cracking open 342 crates of tea and dumping it into the harbor.
The sheer value of that tea is staggering. In modern terms, they destroyed nearly $2 million worth of private property.
And the British reaction was absolute, uncompromising disgust.
They realized that ignoring Boston wasn't working.
Right, and retreating wasn't working. They decided they had to make an example out of Massachusetts to terrify the rest of the colonies into line.
But right as they were planning to drop the hammer on Boston, a massive political scandal erupts over in London involving our old friend, Benjamin Franklin.
This is one of the most pivotal, yet under-discussed turning points of the entire era. Franklin had been quietly given a packet of stolen, highly confidential letters.
And who wrote these letters? None other than Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, the same guy whose house got destroyed by the mob years earlier.
Oh, right.
The letters prove that Hutchinson, who pretended to be a moderate, was secretly urging the British government to send more troops and crack down on colonial liberties.
He wrote that there must be an abridgment of what are called English liberties in America.
Franklin, trying to show the patriot leaders in Massachusetts that the conflict was being driven by a few corrupt officials rather than the king himself, leaked these letters to the Colonial Assembly.
With explicit instructions not to publish them.
Which they completely ignored.
Of course they did. They published them everywhere.
The fallout was immense. It destroyed Hutchinson's career in America, forcing him into exile. But when the British government discovered that Franklin was the leak, they were furious.
They summoned him before the Privy Council, essentially the King's Inner Circle, at a room called the Cockpit in London.
Set the scene for us. This isn't just a meeting.
It's a public execution of character. The room was packed to the rafters with British aristocrats, politicians, and spectators who had come specifically to watch Franklin be humiliated.
It was sweltering hot in there.
For a full hour, the Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn, relentlessly berated Franklin. He called him a thief, an inciter of rebellion, a man without honor.
And the crowd roared with laughter and cheered every insult.
And how did Franklin react?
He stood stock still. He wore a suit of spotted Manchester velvet. He kept his face completely impassive, his head erect, and he didn't utter a single word in his own defense.
He just absorbed the venom.
He did. But internally, that public humiliation was a profound catalyst. The British elite essentially pushed away their best hope for reconciliation.
They took a man who loved England and turned him into a hardened, uncompromising revolutionary.
It's amazing how personal the politics became.
Meanwhile, as Franklin is getting humiliated in London, Parliament is punishing Massachusetts with an unprecedented vengeance. They pass what the colonists call the Intolerable Acts.
A fitting name.
They physically close the port of Boston, crippling the economy. They revoke the Massachusetts Charter, wiping out their Democratic Assembly. They ban town meetings. And they send 3,000 more troops under General Thomas Gage to enforce martial law.
The British assumed that by isolating Massachusetts and crushing them economically, the other 12 colonies would be too frightened to intervene.
But they severely miscalculated.
Completely.
Instead of isolating Boston, it forced the colonies to finally unite. The other colonies realized if Parliament can dissolve the government of Massachusetts and occupy their city, they can do it to any of us.
So, in the fall of 1774, you get the first Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia. 55 delegates from 12 colonies. Georgia didn't send anyone.
The difficulty of getting these delegates to agree on anything cannot be overstated. John Adams described it as trying to get 13 clocks to strike all at the exact same time.
To put that in modern terms, imagine trying to get 13 entirely separate, competing multinational corporations to suddenly share a single bank account, a single board of directors, and a unified legal strategy.
All while knowing that if the strategy fails, the CEOs will all be executed.
Exactly. The colonies had completely different economies. The North was driven by merchants and shipping.
And the South was driven by massive agricultural plantations relying on enslaved labor.
They had different religions, different histories. They saw themselves as Virginians or Pennsylvanians or New Yorkers.
Which is why Patrick Henry's speech at that Congress was so radically paradigm shifting. He stood up and declared, "The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American."
It was the very first time that identity was spoken into existence on a political stage.
They agreed to a massive, unified boycott of British goods. But more ominously, they advised the colonies to begin forming local militias and stockpiling weapons.
The intellectual arguments were over, the petitions had failed, the colonies were preparing for war, and the British commanders in America knew it.
Which brings us to the spring of 1775. General Thomas Gage is sitting in Boston. He has his thousands of troops, but he's essentially trapped in the city because the entire surrounding countryside is heavily armed and hostile.
He receives orders from London to take decisive action.
So he decides to march 800 elite British soldiers out to the town of Concord, about 16 miles away, to seize a massive Patriot weapons cache and arrest the rebel leaders.
Gage planned for absolute secrecy. The troops were to move out under the cover of darkness on the night of April 18th.
But Gage was surrounded by spies.
Oh, completely. The moment the British started preparing their boats to cross the Charles River, the Patriot network knew.
And this brings us to the myth versus reality of Paul Revere. We all know the famous Longfellow poem, right? "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere."
Right.
It paints this picture of a lone, heroic rider galloping bravely through the silent, sleeping countryside to save the day.
It's a wonderful piece of poetry, but it is terrible history. The reality was vastly more impressive.
Revere was not a lone savior. He was a key cog in a massive, highly sophisticated, pre-planned communication network.
Break down how that network actually functioned.
Well, the Patriots knew the British would eventually march. They just didn't know exactly when or by what route. Revere had arranged the famous lantern signal in the Old North Church. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea.
Right, but not to signal himself. To signal riders waiting in Charlestown across the river, just in case Revere couldn't get out of Boston.
Revere did manage to cross the river, and he started riding toward Lexington. But he wasn't alone. William Dawes was taking a completely different route. And as they rode, they didn't just shout in the streets.
No, they specifically woke up town leaders and militia captains.
It was a cascading effect. Revere wakes up a captain. That captain fires a warning shot. The neighboring farm hears the shot and rings a bell. A rider from that town gallops north to the next town.
Within hours, dozens, then scores, then hundreds of messengers were fanning out in every direction.
By the time the British troops actually hit the road, the element of surprise was entirely gone. The countryside was wide awake and armed to the teeth.
So on the morning of April 19th, as the sun is coming up, the vanguard of the British Army arrives at Lexington Green.
And they don't find a sleepy village. They find roughly 130 colonial militiamen standing in formation on the green, blocking their path.
Now imagine the tension. These militiamen are farmers, tavern keepers, shoemakers. They are standing there with their personal hunting muskets.
Facing them is the vanguard of the most disciplined, feared, professional killing machine on the planet, the British regulars.
The British commander screams at the colonists to disperse, to lay down their arms.
The colonial captain, realizing they are massively outnumbered, orders his men to disperse, but crucially, he tells them to keep their weapons. They start to back away, and then a shot rings out.
To this day, nobody knows who fired it.
Really? Nobody?
No. It might have been a panicked colonial. It might have been a trigger-happy British soldier. It might have been someone completely unassociated with either side firing from behind a tavern wall.
But the source of the spark doesn't matter, because the powder keg explodes. The moment that single shot is fired, the British troops, without orders from their commander, level their muskets and unleash a devastating volley directly into the retreating colonists.
They follow it up with a bayonet charge. In less than 2 minutes, the smoke clears and 8 militiamen are dead, bleeding out on their own town green.
The American Revolution had officially begun.
The British commanders eventually regain control of their troops, and they march on to Concord to find the weapons. But the Patriots had already moved most of the cash.
There is a brief skirmish at the North Bridge in Concord. And the British commanders realize the situation is rapidly deteriorating.
Thousands of colonial militiamen are pouring in from the surrounding towns.
The British decide they need to get back to the safety of Boston immediately.
But they have a 16-mile march ahead of them.
And those 16 miles turn into an absolute slaughter.
Yeah.
The militiamen don't line up in a field to fight fair. They swarm the hills, the stone walls, the trees on either side of the road. It becomes a 16-mile gauntlet of sniper fire.
The British took heavy losses, nearly 73 dead and hundreds wounded.
Okay, here's a mechanical question that has always bothered me when picturing these battles, and I need you to explain this.
Sure.
Why on earth were the British marching in tight, straight lines, wearing bright red coats out in the open? To a modern eye, it seems completely suicidal. Why not take cover behind the trees and stone walls like the Americans?
It's a very common question, and it requires understanding the specific military technology of the 18th century. The weapon they used was the smoothbore musket. Unlike a modern rifle, which has spiraled grooves inside the barrel to spin the bullet for accuracy, the inside of a musket was completely smooth.
Okay.
The lead ball they fired was actually smaller than the barrel. This was called windage, which meant that when the gun fired, the ball bounced down the barrel and exited on a completely unpredictable trajectory.
Oh, wow. So you couldn't aim and snipe a specific target from a distance.
Exactly. Beyond 50 yards, a musket was terrifyingly inaccurate. Therefore, in traditional European warfare, you didn't fight as individuals. You fought as a massive, unified bloc.
I see.
To inflict mass casualties, commanders needed a concentrated line of men standing shoulder to shoulder, pointing their weapons in the general direction of the enemy, and firing a synchronized volley all at once. It essentially turned a row of men into a giant shotgun.
And the bright red uniforms.
Those were a functional necessity. When a line of men fired their muskets, the black powder produced a thick, choking, sulfuric cloud of white smoke.
Making it impossible to see.
Right. After 2 volleys, a battlefield was completely obscured. Commanders needed their men in brightly colored uniforms so they could see their formations through the fog of war.
That makes perfect sense for a flat European battlefield.
But during the retreat from Concord, the Americans weren't playing by European rules. They were using the terrain, the stone walls, the dense woods to break up the British formations.
The British linear tactics were completely useless against a dispersed enemy firing from cover.
It was a trauma the British soldiers didn't forget, and it proved conclusively to the world that the colonists could actually fight and bleed the British Empire.
So Gage's battered army limps back into Boston, and almost overnight, thousands of colonial militiamen surround the city, essentially trapping the British inside.
But while this standoff is happening in Massachusetts, another crazy event unfolds hundreds of miles north in upstate New York at Fort Ticonderoga.
This is a massive fort guarding the water route from Canada, supposedly packed with artillery.
And the capture of this fort introduces us to the incredible clash of egos that defined much of the Patriot leadership.
We tend to view the founding generation as selfless public servants, but many of them were fiercely ambitious men driven by personal glory.
Enter Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen.
Yes. Benedict Arnold is this wealthy, aggressive, highly disciplined merchant-turned-officer from Connecticut. He secures a commission to go take Fort Ticonderoga.
But when he gets there, he runs into Ethan Allen.
Ethan Allen is the leader of a local militia called the Green Mountain Boys, a group of giant, hard-drinking frontiersmen who essentially view the war as an excuse to brawl.
Arnold arrives in his crisp uniform, holding his official orders, and expects to take absolute command. But the Green Mountain Boys literally laugh at him.
They refuse to take orders from anyone but Ethan Allen.
It completely shatters the illusion of these guys as noble patriots. They were acting like rival CEOs fighting over who gets their name on a press release.
Arnold is humiliatingly forced to march as co-commander. Now, the actual capture of the fort is incredibly anticlimactic. The British garrison there was tiny, unaware there was even a war going on, and the gate was essentially left unlocked. They burst in and demand surrender.
But the aftermath is where the true character of these men is revealed.
It is so petty. Inside the fort, Allen's men find 90 gallons of rum. They immediately ignore all discipline and go on a massive 3-day bender.
Arnold is furious, trying to restore military order, and they just ignore him.
Then Ethan Allen sits down to write the official dispatch to Congress, announcing the great victory. And he deliberately leaves Benedict Arnold's name out of the report entirely. He steals every ounce of the credit.
And you can literally see the seeds of Arnold's future treason being planted right there in the dirt of Ticonderoga. Arnold was an exceptionally brave and capable battlefield commander, but his ego was incredibly fragile.
He felt constantly slighted.
Right, constantly overlooked by Congress, and that festering resentment eventually curdled into the most famous betrayal in American history.
Down in Philadelphia, the Continental Congress receives news of Lexington, Concord, and Ticonderoga with a mix of elation and sheer panic. They're trying to manage this rapidly escalating crisis.
They look at the thousands of men surrounding Boston, and they realize a harsh truth that isn't an army. It's a heavily armed, highly opinionated mob.
If they're going to fight the British Empire, they need to create a unified national continental army. And to do that, they need a single commander-in-chief.
Which brings us to the political genius of George Washington.
Yes. Section 4 of our source material dives deep into the reluctant commander. Congress appoints George Washington. Now, Washington stands up in Congress and gives this incredibly modest speech.
He says, "I beg it may be remembered by every gentleman in the room that I this day declare with the utmost sincerity I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with."
He is telling them, I don't want the job, I'm not good enough for the job.
But what is he wearing while he says this?
He is wearing his old military uniform. In fact, he had been showing up to the Continental Congress every single day wearing a tailored, conspicuous military uniform.
It's like someone showing up to a casual Friday at the office wearing a tailored three-piece power suit while loudly telling everyone around the water cooler that they really, really don't want the big promotion.
He was aggressively dressing for the job he wanted while verbally claiming he didn't want it.
It was a masterclass in disingenuous modesty. Washington was fiercely ambitious, but he understood the delicate political psychology of the moment better than anyone.
The Congress was terrified of creating a standing army.
Right. They were terrified of replacing a British tyrant with an American military dictator. Oliver Cromwell was a recent historical memory for them. If Washington had aggressively campaigned for the job, they never would have given it to him.
He had to look like a reluctant savior.
Exactly. He had to convince them he was taking the sword only out of duty and that he would happily lay it down when the job was done.
His background is fascinating because he wasn't born into the massive, untouchable wealth of some of his peers. His father died when he was young.
As a teenager, he was obsessed with a book called Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior, literally copying out 110 rules of etiquette by hand.
He was constantly trying to construct this persona of the perfect, stoic gentleman. He eventually gained his immense wealth by marrying Martha Custis, the richest widow in Virginia.
And his military record before this. It wasn't great. He had made some disastrous, deeply flawed tactical decisions as a young man in the French and Indian War.
But tactically, he was the only logical choice for Congress. John Adams recognized this. All the fighting was happening in New England. If the war remained a New England conflict, the southern colonies would eventually lose interest and the rebellion would collapse.
They desperately needed a Virginian, a wealthy, respected Southern aristocrat, to take command of the New England army to physically and politically bind the colonies together.
So Washington gets his dream job. But before he can even ride to Boston to take command, we get a brutal reminder of the personal cost of this war. I want to circle back to Benjamin Franklin for a moment.
When Franklin finally returns to America from London, his perspective has radically shifted. But he faces a heartbreaking reality within his own family.
His only son, William Franklin, is the royal governor of New Jersey, and William is unalterably devoted to the king.
This is a crucial element of the Revolution that is almost entirely glossed over in popular history. We think of it as Americans versus the British. But the American Revolution was fundamentally a vicious, intimate civil war.
Neighbors fought neighbors, communities tore each other apart, and the split between Benjamin and William Franklin is the most poignant example of this.
You picture them having a political debate over dinner, but it was so much deeper than that. Benjamin tried to convince William to join the Patriots. William refused, believing the rebellion would lead to anarchy and the destruction of the colonies.
William was eventually arrested by the Patriots and thrown into a horrific, freezing prison in Connecticut, where his health completely failed, his teeth fell out, and he was held in solitary confinement.
And Benjamin Franklin, the great diplomat, the man of reason, did absolutely nothing to help his son. He was unyielding. He felt that by siding with the crown, William was essentially endorsing the execution of his own father.
They never reconciled. William eventually went into exile in England, and Benjamin virtually cut him out of his will. That exact same familial tragedy was playing out in thousands of households across the continent.
It is utterly tragic, and the violence is rapidly escalating. Before Washington can even reach Massachusetts, the bloodiest battle of the early war occurs in Boston, the Battle of Bunker Hill. Though, as our sources point out, it was technically fought on Breed's Hill.
The Patriots had moved overnight to fortify a hill on the Charlestown Peninsula, overlooking the British fleet in the harbor. When the British commanders woke up and saw the dirt fort, they knew they had to remove the threat immediately.
The British commander, General William Howe, decides to launch a frontal assault. They don't try to surround the hill, they don't wait them out.
They just marched 2,000 highly trained troops, weighed down by heavy gear, straight up a steep hill in the blistering summer heat, directly into the fortified guns of the Americans.
It was an act of profound arrogance and a horrific tactical miscalculation. Howe believed that a slow, disciplined march by professional soldiers would absolutely terrify the rabble into running away.
But the Americans didn't run. The famous order, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," was issued because the Americans were desperately low on gunpowder. They couldn't afford to waste a single shot.
They waited until the British were a mere 50 yards away and then unleashed a devastating wall of lead.
The British ranks were shattered. They retreated, reformed, and marched up the hill a second time, stepping over the bleeding bodies of their own comrades. The Americans repelled them again.
The British finally took the hill on the third charge, but only because the Americans literally ran out of ammunition and had to retreat, fighting hand-to-hand with rocks and the butts of their muskets.
It was a technical victory for the British, but at an unspeakable cost.
The British suffered nearly 1,000 casualties. Almost half of their entire attacking force was killed or wounded in a single afternoon. General Howe was deeply traumatized by the slaughter. He realized with absolute clarity that this was not a minor colonial skirmish. He was fighting a deeply entrenched, lethal enemy.
But on the American side, Bunker Hill creates a massive systemic problem. Yes, they lost the hill, but they inflicted such massive damage on the greatest army in the world that they developed this incredibly dangerous false confidence.
A militiaman started believing that one American farmer, fueled by the spirit of liberty, was inherently superior to 5 British regulars.
It was the grand, fatal illusion of 1775. They believed passion could replace professional discipline. And when George Washington finally arrived in Cambridge a few weeks later to take command, that illusion was instantaneously shattered.
Washington's arrival at the camp is almost comical in its horror. He expects to find an army of noble patriots. Instead, he finds an absolute disaster zone.
The camps are sprawling and completely disorganized. The soldiers are wearing civilian clothes. They are covered in dirt. They lack basic hygiene. They are constantly drinking. And this is the detail that truly broke my brain. They were electing their own officers.
It was anathema to Washington's entire worldview. Washington was an aristocrat who believed deeply in social hierarchy and rigid military order. To him, an army where the privates could vote their captain out of office if he was too strict was not an army. It was an armed mob waiting to be slaughtered.
So Washington institutes a regime of brutal, unforgiving discipline. He realizes he has to break their independent spirit to forge a functioning military machine.
He orders floggings, 39 lashes on a bareback with a cat o' nine tails just for expressing disrespect to an officer. He drums people out of camp with ropes around their necks.
He has to literally teach grown men how to dig proper latrines and bury their waste so disease doesn't wipe them all out.
He was trying to build a common military culture out of men from radically different backgrounds, but his internal problems with discipline paled in comparison to his logistical nightmare.
Right. Shortly after taking command, Washington orders a full inventory of their ammunition. The quartermasters do the math, they come to his headquarters, and they give him the number. They have exactly 9 rounds of gunpowder per man.
9 shots. If the British attack, the American Revolution will be over in 10 minutes.
Washington is supposedly so terrified by this news that he doesn't speak for half an hour. He has to maintain this facade of strength to the British while knowing his entire army is a paper tiger.
But as dire as the logistics were, there is a much deeper, more profound issue that arises in the camp that summer. We have to confront the glaring, unavoidable hypocrisy at the heart of this war for liberty.
And this is where the marble statues truly crumble. From the very beginning of the conflict, free black men in the North had been fighting for the patriot cause. Black soldiers fought bravely at Lexington, at Concord, and at Bunker Hill.
But when Washington, a Virginia slaveholder, takes command, he is deeply uncomfortable with armed black men. He holds a council of war, and they make the active decision to ban all black recruits, free or enslaved, from joining the Continental Army.
It highlights the most painful contradiction of the era. The southern colonies, whose economies were entirely dependent on the brutal subjugation of enslaved labor, were absolutely terrified of arming black men.
They feared a slave rebellion far more than they feared the British. Washington issued the order, claiming that the rights of mankind could be secured without their assistance. The moral cognitive dissonance is staggering.
And the British recognized this hypocrisy immediately, and they weaponized it brilliantly.
Right.
In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issues a proclamation.
He officially declares martial law, and he promises absolute freedom to any enslaved person owned by a patriot who escapes their master and joins the British forces.
Dunmore's proclamation was not necessarily driven by high moral abolitionism. It was a devastating, calculated weapon of war.
It was psychological and economic warfare. By offering freedom, he instantly deprived the Southern plantation owners of their labor force, crippled their economy, and swelled the ranks of the British military.
Tens of thousands of enslaved people took the unimaginable risk to flee to British lines. They recognized that the British king, not the American patriots, was the true agent of their personal liberty.
It forced the patriots to look in the mirror. And when you look at Washington personally, the irony becomes almost unbearable. The one man who was closest to Washington, who rode with him every single day, who brushed his horses and prepared his meals, was his enslaved valet, William Billy Lee.
I really pressed myself on this dynamic while reading the sources. How could Washington sit in his tent at night writing impassioned letters to Congress about the sacred universal rights of mankind and the evils of British slavery, while actively banning black patriots from fighting, knowing thousands of enslaved people were risking their lives to reach the British for actual freedom, all while keeping Billy Lee legally enslaved right by his side?
It's a huge question.
They were constant companions. They survived freezing winters and enemy fire together. Yet, legally, Lee was merely a piece of property. How did Washington compartmentalize that?
It is the defining moral failure of the founding generation. They possessed the intellectual capacity to understand the contradiction. Many of them acknowledged privately that slavery was a moral evil.
But they prioritized their own political unity, their economic wealth, and their social hierarchy over the universal application of their stated principles.
Unraveling the knot of slavery threatened to shatter the fragile colonial alliance, so they actively chose to protect the institution.
It's a dark, sobering reality that must remain central to the narrative. Meanwhile, as the political and moral complexities deepen, the physical standoff in Boston remains frozen through the winter. Washington is trapped outside to the Resi. The British are trapped inside.
Until a 25-year-old former bookseller pulls off one of the greatest logistical miracles in military history.
Henry Knox. He was a massive man, deeply read in military engineering, though he'd never actually fought in a battle. He proposes an insane idea to Washington. He will travel 300 miles north of Fort Ticonderoga in the dead of winter, retrieve the massive cannons captured by Ethan Allen, and drag them all the way back to Boston.
And Washington, desperate for artillery, says yes. So Knox goes to Ticonderoga. He has to move 120,000 pounds of iron and brass. He has no roads, no trucks, no planes. He relies on sheer brute force.
He builds specialized sleds, he hires local farmers, and essentially drafts hundreds of oxen. They drag these massive cannons across freezing lakes, praying the ice doesn't crack. They haul them up and down the treacherous, snow-covered peaks of the Berkshire Mountains.
It took him over 40 days in sub-zero temperatures, fighting blizzards and broken equipment, but he did it. He delivered the noble train of artillery to Washington's camp.
Washington immediately seizes the advantage. In a brilliant overnight maneuver, he moves those cannons to the top of Dorchester Heights, a hill looking directly down into Boston Harbor. When General Howe wakes up the next morning and looks up through spyglass, he realizes he is entirely trapped.
The American cannons can sink his entire fleet. Howe famously remarked that the rebels had done more work in one night than his entire army could do in months. He had no choice.
The British were forced to evacuate Boston without a single shot being fired. They loaded their troops and thousands of terrified loyalists onto ships and sailed away to Canada.
It is a massive, bloodless victory for Washington. But with the British temporarily chased away, the physical violence pauses, giving space for a revolution of the mind.
Because up until this point, early 1776, the colonists were still fighting to stay in the British Empire, just with better representation. They were still toasting the king's health at dinner. It took a broke, unknown immigrant to convince them to break away entirely.
Thomas Paine is arguably the most fascinating, consequential writer of the era. He arrived in Philadelphia from England in late 1774, practically dead from typhus. He had failed at almost everything he tried in life.
He was a failed corset maker, a failed merchant. He was even fired from his job as a tax collector twice. But he carried with him the potent, radical ideas of the European Enlightenment.
In January 1776, Paine anonymously publishes a 46-page pamphlet called Common Sense.
And I am in awe of Thomas Paine. Common Sense was the 18th century equivalent of a viral, highly persuasive podcast or blog post that completely shifted the Overton window of American politics.
And by shifting the Overton window, we mean that Paine took ideas that were considered extreme, crazy fringe talk, like entirely overthrowing the monarchy, and suddenly made them the acceptable mainstream center of conversation.
Exactly. Before Common Sense, independence was a radical whisper. Paine argued fiercely that monarchy itself was a corrupt, absurd institution. He asked, why should an island rule a continent?
But his true genius wasn't just the philosophy, it was the delivery. He didn't write in the dense, Latin-laced prose of lawyers like John Adams. He translated high-minded Enlightenment philosophy into plain, fiery, incendiary English that a farmer, a blacksmith, or a fishmonger could read out loud in a tavern and completely understand.
It was a publishing phenomenon. It sold roughly 100,000 copies in a population of 2.5 million.
Yeah.
Proportional to the population, it remained one of the best-selling American titles in history.
It completely rewired the colonial mindset. It gave the public a shared vocabulary for revolution and made the unthinkable, a total break from the king, seem not only logical, but morally destined.
And that intense public pressure, bubbling up from the taverns and the town squares, forces the Continental Congress to finally cross the Rubicon. In the summer of 1776, they appoint a committee to draft a formal Declaration of Independence.
They turned to a 33-year-old, exceptionally quiet Virginia lawyer named Thomas Jefferson to do the actual writing.
Jefferson drafts it over several days in the sweltering heat of a rented room in Philadelphia, fighting off horseflies from a nearby stable. He draws heavily on the philosophies of John Locke, articulating the radical premise that rights do not come from a king, but are inherent to humanity, and that governments only exist through the consent of the governed.
He writes the most famous sentence in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. But what happens after he submits his draft is brutal.
Congress takes his beautiful prose and spends 3 days tearing it apart line by line. As a writer, I can feel his pain. They strike out 89 items. They delete a quarter of the entire text. And the most significant, glaring omission is Jefferson's blistering paragraph condemning the slave trade.
This is the tragic, defining compromise at the heart of the nation's birth. Jefferson, who himself enslaved hundreds of human beings and never freed them, had drafted a long, hypocritical but fiery passage blaming the King of England for forcing the exorable commerce of slavery onto the colonies.
But the Southern delegates, South Carolina and Georgia especially, read that paragraph and essentially said, if that stays in, we walk. And frankly, Northern merchants who profited heavily from the transatlantic shipping of enslaved people were happy to see it go too.
They faced a stark existential choice. If they forced the issue of abolition, the Southern colonies would leave the coalition. The rebellion would splinter, the British would easily crush the divided colonies, and the delegates in that room would all be hanged for high treason.
So they deliberately chose to delete the clause. They prioritized immediate political survival and unity over their own stated moral principles.
But wasn't that just taking the easy, cowardly way out? They had the opportunity to literally begin the world over again, as Paine had said. They knew slavery was a cancer on their ideals, but they explicitly chose to build their new republic on a foundation of hypocrisy just to keep the South in the room.
By kicking that can down the road, they guaranteed that the issue would eventually tear the country apart in the massive bloodshed of the Civil War less than a century later.
From a purely pragmatic standpoint, in 1776, they believed compromise was the only path to creating a nation capable of fighting Britain. But morally, yes, it was a devastating failure of courage that stained the Republic from its inception.
And the physical stakes for the men signing that parchment could not have been higher. John Hancock signs his name large enough for the king to read without spectacles, but they all knew the reality. If Washington's army failed, that document was a confession to high treason.
The penalty for treason wasn't just a hanging. You were hanged, drawn, and quartered. They were signing their own death warrants.
And that terrifying reality arrived almost immediately. The ink on the Declaration was barely dry when the British Empire returned. And they didn't respond to common sense with a pamphlet of their own. They responded with an apocalyptic show of military force.
This brings us to the summer of 1776 and the disaster in New York. We transition from the soaring intellectual highs of Philadelphia to the bloody, muddy reality of the battlefield. The British arrive in New York Harbor, and the sheer scale of it is unimaginable.
It was the largest seaborne invasion force the British Empire had ever assembled. Over 130 warships, heavily armed with cannons, carrying 32,000 professional soldiers and mercenaries.
Imagine standing on the shores of Manhattan or Brooklyn and looking out at the harbor to see a forest of wooden masts so thick it looked like an entirely new island had grown out of the water. It was, quite literally, like the Death Star appearing in the sky. It was pure psychological shock and awe meant to terrify the Americans into immediate surrender before a single shot was fired.
The strategic importance of New York was paramount. Whoever controlled the Deepwater Harbor and the Hudson River could sever the radical New England colonies from the agricultural Southern colonies, essentially breaking the spine of the rebellion.
Right.
Washington knew he had to defend it, but he was vastly out of his league. He had no navy to counter the Armada.
So the Americans try this bizarre, entirely desperate, wildly futuristic weapon to fight the ships. It's called the Turtle. It is the world's first combat submarine.
It is a testament to American ingenuity, but also to their sheer desperation. Explain how this contraption actually worked, because it sounds like a steampunk nightmare.
It was a one-man vessel built of heavy oak, shaped roughly like a giant walnut or an acorn, covered in tar to make it waterproof. The operator, a man named Ezra Lee, sat inside in complete darkness. To dive, he had to operate a foot pedal to let water into a ballast tank. To move forward, he had to furiously crank a hand-turned propeller.
He's basically underwater in a pitch-black barrel, pedaling a bicycle with his hands, breathing whatever little air is trapped inside. And what was the actual combat objective?
The plan was for Lee to paddle out into the harbor at night, submerge beneath a massive British warship, use a hand-cranked auger to drill a hole into the ship's wooden hull, attach a 150-pound keg of gunpowder on a timer, and paddle away before it exploded.
It's an incredible idea. But the reality?
The reality was an operational failure. Lee managed to get under a British ship, but the auger hit an iron plate, or perhaps the wood was simply too dense. He couldn't drill the hole. The current in the harbor was incredibly strong, he was exhausted from cranking, and he eventually had to release the bomb, which floated away and exploded harmlessly in the East River. It perfectly illustrates how wildly outmatched the Continental Army was. They were relying on highly experimental, frantic gadgets against the greatest naval machine on Earth.
Which leads directly to the sheer tactical disaster of the Battle of Long Island. Washington knows the British will attack Brooklyn, but his strategic naivete is completely exposed here. He divides his forces between Manhattan and Brooklyn, violating a core military rule against splitting an army in the face of a superior force. Then, he lines up his men along a ridge in Brooklyn for a traditional European field battle.
Washington believed the British would launch a frontal assault, similar to Bunker Hill, but General William Howe had learned his lesson. He had no intention of marching his men straight into American guns again.
So Howe executes a brilliant flanking maneuver. Explain how he pulled this off.
Howe used a small portion of his army to attack the American front lines directly as a noisy decoy. The Americans fought back, thinking they were holding the line. But under the cover of night, Howe took the vast majority of his army, 10,000 men, and marched them on a long, looping detour far to the east through a narrow, unguarded path called the Jamaica Pass.
Unguarded. Washington had left only 5 young militia officers on horseback to watch this crucial road.
The British easily captured the 5 officers, marched completely around the American line, and suddenly attacked them from the rear. The Americans were completely surrounded. The line ruptured instantly. When soldiers realize they are trapped, panic is contagious. The Americans broke and ran for their lives, trying to flee through the swamps of Gowanus. Hundreds drowned or were bayoneted in the mud. It was a complete tactical humiliation for Washington.
Washington's battered army is pushed all the way back to the edge of the East River in Brooklyn. They are trapped against the water, surrounded on all sides by a vastly superior British force, with the British Navy waiting to sail up the river and cut off their only escape route. By all military logic, the American Revolution should have ended right there in late August 1776.
Howe paused. He decided to dig siege trenches rather than risk another bloody infantry assault, assuming he could trap Washington at his leisure. It was the crucial window Washington needed.
Washington realizes he has to evacuate his entire army across the mile-wide East River over to Manhattan. He issues a frantic secret order to round up every rowboat, ferry, and skiff in the area. Under the cover of darkness, regiment by regiment, the soldiers silently board the boats. But the wind is against them. The process is agonizingly slow. As the sun begins to rise, a huge portion of the American army is still trapped on the Brooklyn shore. If the British see them, they will be massacred.
And this is where we encounter the miracle fog.
Just as the sun is coming up, a mysteriously dense, incredibly heady fog rolls in over the harbor and settles directly over the Brooklyn shore. It is a near blackout. The fog is so thick you can't see 6 feet in front of your face. It muffles the sound of the oars. The British forces, camped just hundreds of yards away, can't see or hear a thing.
Washington's logistical genius in coordinating that massive flotilla of small boats was remarkable, but it was absolutely saved by that profound stroke of meteorological luck. Washington himself was the last man to step onto a boat. When the morning sun finally burned the fog away, General Howe looked at the American trenches and found an entirely empty camp.
It was a massive blunder by the British, but Washington's relief is incredibly short-lived. He escapes Brooklyn, but he can't hold Manhattan. He is forced into a humiliating, weeks-long retreat north through the island, losing skirmish after skirmish. He eventually has to abandon New York City entirely, leaving it to the British for the rest of the war. But during this retreat, he makes a catastrophic command error. He leaves a garrison of nearly 3,000 men at Fort Washington on the northern tip of Manhattan.
Washington had deep reservations about leaving them there, but his subordinate, General Nathaniel Greene, convinced him the fort could hold. It was a terrible miscalculation.
The British unleashed their most terrifying asset to take the fort, the Hessians.
The Hessians were professional German mercenaries hired by King George to bolster his forces. They were highly disciplined, heavily armed, and deeply feared. They didn't view this conflict as a civil war among brethren. For them, it was a job, and they operated by a harsh, almost medieval code of warfare where plunder, looting, and extreme brutality were part of the compensation.
They attacked Fort Washington with absolute ferocity. They overwhelmed the defenses in mere hours, forcing the massive American garrison to surrender. The Hessians bayoneted soldiers trying to surrender. It was a bloodbath. And it's here, amidst this terror, we have one of those incredible stories of individual courage. Molly Corbin.
Yes, Margaret Molly Corbin. She had followed her husband, an artilleryman, into battle, which was common for women of the time, serving as camp followers to cook and do laundry. When the fort was attacked, her husband was manning a cannon. He was shot and killed right in front of her.
Instead of running, she immediately stepped up, took over the cannon, and continued swabbing, loading, and firing it at the Hessians until she herself was severely wounded by grape shot that nearly severed her arm. The cause required everyone. But despite her bravery, the loss of Fort Washington was total. 3,000 American soldiers were captured, along with massive, irreplaceable stockpiles of weapons and cannons.
The psychological terror inflicted by the Hessians, combined with the catastrophic string of defeats, horrified everybody. Washington's army was disintegrating before his eyes.
Which brings us to our final desperate act of 1776. Mutiny, misery, and the miracle at Trenton. It is late November, moving into December. The Continental Army is in full retreat across New Jersey, trying to keep ahead of the pursuing British. It is freezing, it is raining, the men don't have winter coats, many don't even have shoes, they are leaving bloody footprints in the snow. And Washington's command is unraveling. His own second-in-command, General Charles Lee, is actively sabotaging him.
Charles Lee was an eccentric, highly experienced former British officer. He commanded a large detachment of the Continental Army and was supposed to be marching to reinforce Washington. But Lee believed he was vastly superior to Washington in military intellect. He actively plotted with other officers and politicians to take Washington's job. When Washington sent frantic couriers begging for Lee to march his troops to join him, Lee deliberately stalled. He hoped Washington's army would be entirely destroyed so he could swoop in as the brilliant savior of the rebellion.
But karma catches up to Charles Lee in the most absurd, comical way possible. Lee finally starts slowly moving his troops, but he decides he doesn't want to sleep in a freezing tent with his men. So he leaves his army and rides several miles away to sleep in a comfortable bed at a local tavern called Widow White's.
He essentially abandoned his command post for a hot breakfast and a warm fire.
Exactly. It's the morning of December 13th. Lee hasn't even dressed yet. He's sitting around the tavern in his slippers and a dressing gown, literally writing a letter to another general bad-mouthing Washington, calling him most damnably deficient. Suddenly, a patrol of British cavalry, led by a young banisher Tarleton, surrounds the tavern. They smash the windows and capture Lee. He doesn't even put up a fight. He is dragged away in his nightgown. It's so embarrassing.
While Lee's capture was deeply humiliating for him, it actually solved a massive political problem for Washington by abruptly removing his chief rival. The remaining troops were quickly marched to join Washington. But even with those reinforcements, the broader situation was unimaginably grim.
Morale is at absolute rock bottom. The thousands of men captured at Fort Washington are being thrown into decommissioned British warships anchored in New York Harbor, the most infamous being the HMS Jersey.
The conditions on those prison ships were barbaric. They were floating dungeons. The men were packed below decks in total darkness with no ventilation. Disease, smallpox, typhus, yellow fever ran rampant. They were fed rotten food. Men were dying by the thousands. More Americans died on those prison ships than died in all the actual combat of the Revolutionary War combined.
Word of this terror spreads. Soldiers are deserting every night. The citizens are giving up, going to the British, and swearing oaths of loyalty just to protect their families. Thomas Paine, the man who wrote Common Sense, is marching with the freezing army. He realizes the physical war is lost unless the intellectual war is won again. So at night, by the light of a campfire, using a drumhead as a desk, he writes a new pamphlet, The American Crisis.
And he opens it with some of the most powerful, enduring words in American history. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman.
Washington has the pamphlet read aloud to every regiment. It provides a momentary spark of morale, but Washington knows words aren't enough. The clock is ticking. The enlistment contracts for nearly his entire army expire at midnight on December 31st. After that, they are legally free to go home. If Washington doesn't act before the new year, the army will dissolve and the revolution will simply cease to exist.
Washington realizes his profound strategic error. He had spent the entire year trying to fight a traditional European war against a massive European empire, and he had nearly lost everything. He pivots entirely. He realizes that territory doesn't matter. Cities don't matter. As long as the Continental Army survives, the revolution survives. He adopts a strategy of speed, stealth, and insurgency, and he devises a massive do-or-die gamble, a surprise attack on an isolated garrison of Hessians camped at the town of Trenton, New Jersey on Christmas Day.
Put yourself in the position of these soldiers. Washington orders them to march to the edge of the Delaware River. It is Christmas night. A vicious nor'easter hits. It's not just snowing, it's sleet, freezing rain, and howling winds. They have to cross the river in these massive, heavy, flat-bottomed iron ore boats called Durham boats. The river is choked with huge chunks of jagged ice violently smashing against the hulls.
The crossing was supposed to be completed by midnight so they could attack before dawn. But the weather was so severe that moving the men, the horses, and Henry Knox's heavy cannons onto the slippery boats took hours longer than planned. 2 men actually froze to death on the march.
They are massively behind schedule. By the time they finally cross the river and march 9 miles to Trenton, the sun is coming up. The element of a dark surprise is gone. If the Hessians are awake and on the defensive, Washington's exhausted men will be slaughtered. But here is the crazy part. The Hessian commander, Colonel Johann Rall, had completely let his guard down. Why? Because its immediate commanding officer, a man named General von Donop, decided to leave his post and spend Christmas Eve with a beautiful, young, wealthy widow in the town of Mount Holly, 20 miles away.
It is one of those tiny, unpredictable hinges of history. Because von Donop was distracted by a romantic rendezvous, he drew away a significant portion of the Hessian forces, leaving Colonel Rall isolated at Trenton. And Rall, arrogant and contemptuous of the Americans, hadn't bothered to build defensive redoubts. He assumed the Americans were incapable of launching a coordinated attack in the middle of a severe winter storm.
Now I have to ask you this. Was attacking on Christmas in a blinding blizzard against a resting enemy considered dishonorable or cheating by the European military standards of the day?
By the rigid, gentlemanly codes of 18th century European warfare, it was absolutely highly unconventional and certainly deeply frowned upon by British officers. You generally retreated to winter quarters when the snow fell. You didn't fight in the dead of winter, and you certainly didn't launch unprovoked surprise attacks at dawn on a holy holiday. But Washington had realized that playing by European rules guaranteed an American defeat. He had to completely change the paradigm. Survival was the only rule that mattered now.
And the gamble pays off brilliantly. The American forces swarm into Trenton from 2 sides. Henry Knox sets his cannons up at the top of the main streets and clears them with grape shot. The Hessians stumble out of their warm quarters, totally disoriented. Colonel Rowell tries to rally his men, but he is shot and mortally wounded. The battle is over in less than an hour. The Americans capture nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers, along with massive supplies of food, boots, and weapons, and they do it while suffering almost zero combat fatalities.
It was a stunning, miraculous victory that instantly reversed the psychological collapse of the Patriot cause. It proved Washington could fight, and it proved the terrifying Hessians could be beaten.
But the victory almost slipped through his fingers immediately. It's December 30th. The enlistments expire the next day. The men have achieved their great victory, and they want to go home to their farms. Washington orders the regiments to form up. He rides his horse in front of them and begs them to stay. He tells them they have done everything asked of them, but the fate of the country is hanging by a thread. He asks who will stay for just 6 more weeks.
And initially, nobody steps forward. They were exhausted, freezing, and they had done their duty.
So Washington plays his final card. He offers a $10 bounty, which was more than a month's pay to any man who will stay.
A bounty, it must be noted, that he did not actually have the money for. Congress was broke. He was writing checks on the sheer force of his own credibility, praying a financier in Philadelphia could raise the cash in time.
It's the ultimate bluff. He makes the offer, the drums roll, and slowly over half the men step forward. They agree to stay. The Army survives into January 1777. And because the Army survives, the Revolution survives.
When we look back at the entirety of 1776, it was a profound roller coaster. It began with the towering intellectual triumphs of common sense and the drafting of the Declaration. It plunged into devastating, bloody, near-fatal tactical disasters in New York. Washington started the year trying to fight like a traditional European general, and he nearly lost the entire country. He ended the year fighting like a desperate insurgent, using stealth, weather, and absolute audacity, and he saved the cause.
It completely reframes everything we think we know. History often feels like it was written in stone, inevitable and destined from the start. We look at the marble statues and think they always knew they were going to win. But this deep dive proves it was built on incredibly messy human decisions, massive risks, deep moral hypocrisies, and sometimes sheer dumb luck. When you face overwhelming odds or a system that seems totally unbeatable, remember Washington's ultimate realization on the banks of the Delaware when the old rules guarantee your defeat? You have to completely change the way you play the game.
The margins of history are razor thin. We study these vast movements of troops and sweeping political documents, but often the fate of a nation rests on a single foggy morning or an arrogant commander's underestimation of his enemy.
I want to leave you, the listener, with this thought to ponder today. Think about how incredibly fragile the foundation of the modern world really is. What if Ezra Lee's auger had successfully drilled into that British ship and the submarine actually worked? What if that strange, dense fog hadn't rolled into New York Harbor on that exact night in August, hiding Washington's escape? Or what if General von Donop hadn't decided to visit a mysterious widow in Mount Holly on Christmas Eve, and Colonel Rowell had full reinforcements waiting at Trenton? How much of the world as we know it, the rights we enjoy, the borders we draw, hinges on the smallest, most random, unpredictable twists of fate? Keep questioning the narrative, and keep diving deep into the sources.